This is a film about women who had to abort their daughters. About men who can no longer find a wife. About girls who are kidnapped for that reason. And about desperate parents. Guangxi is a province in southern China. Pang Shendong and Wu Aishen are parents who are searching for their daughter. 3-year-old Pang Shuting disappeared a month ago without trace. At first, nobody believed that something terrible could have occurred in this peaceful village where everyone knows each other. But the search for her has remained fruitless.
晚上我们也继续找，也通宵，然后反正这几天都在通宵的找，都没有。
大概5天5夜吧。
一直都在找。
All that remains for the parents are their memories and baby photos from happier times.
这个台湾刚回来不几天嘛，那个小眼睛，你看，多看看吧，好可爱。
Du Yin knows a lot of despairing parents. He works for a relief organization. Throughout China, there are already 200,000 volunteers searching for missing girls such as Pang Shuting.
比如说，有的女孩像儿子，像特别是福建这边，儿子那婚礼现在我们中国这种现在这种现象也普遍。 儿子结婚嘛，成本特别高，这个财经问题，这是普遍现象，很高了。所以有的地方，比如像福建，就拐入大省啊，这种家长买一个孩子，买个女孩过来做童养媳也很正常的。
There is a shortage of millions of women in the world's most populous country. 135 boys are born for every 100 girls in some provinces of China. This is the result of an experiment that started decades ago on the other side of the world, in the USA after World War II. It was the era of the economic miracle. People in the West were doing better than ever before, if not for the fear that their prosperity could soon come to an end. A big concern was constantly growing populations due to medical advances, especially in developing countries. Affluent Americans started a new movement. Together, they wanted to curb the large numbers of children worldwide. Most of them were men, from well-known scientists to the super-rich like John D. Rockefeller III. They were people with influence and connections to the highest levels of the American government. Their foundations continue to exist today. The Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Population Council. They triggered a rising tide of fear of a population explosion that soon also spread to other countries, and they formed the head of worldwide measures taken to decimate the population of the impoverished. This has been examined by Matthew Connolly, a historian at Columbia University in New York. He has researched in detail the development of this movement from its beginnings to its impact today.
Population Council saw its mandate not just to control the rate of population growth, but also to address problems in the quality of population. So they had an explicit mandate to try to do something about the growth of the fertility rates among people who they thought would eventually take over the world if something wasn't done to reduce fertility rates across the board, but especially among people who they thought would be poor parents and would have even more poor children.
This way of thinking also took hold in American politics in 1966. U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson attached conditions for receiving development aid, one of them being that recipient countries must reduce their population. It was a time of drought and starvation in India. The president spoke on the phone with the Secretary of Agriculture.
Then you just put out this morning instructions to all your people that the president says any future allotments, he wants to know what we give, and Exhibit A, he wants to know what we get. So let's evaluate that too. And I know the first sentence will be, we feed a lot of hungry children. I know that, so I don't need to be told. But just tell me what else we get out of it. Usually we just get kicked in the pants. That's what she does to us.
He stopped food deliveries until Indira Gandhi bowed to the demands. Accusations were made that the West had imperialistic intentions with its population control projects. A department was founded at the United Nations in 1969, the UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund. Through this ostensibly neutral path, Western governments channeled millions into population control in developing countries. The major donors, besides the United States, were Sweden, Great Britain, Germany, and Switzerland. South Korea was among the earliest testing grounds for population control. The country was devastated after the Korean War. At the same time, there was a baby boom with the highest birth rates in the world. The United States participated in the reconstruction from the very beginning, population control being high on the agenda. These 4 Korean women grew up in a village 200 kilometers from Seoul and still remember the war and the time that followed.
옛날 어머니 때는 많이 낳고 우리 때는 한 셋 낳기. 자금금융운동이 62년도 해가지고 박정희 대통령이 우리나라 인구가 너무 많고 땅덩이 적고 가족계에 대해서 마을 주민들 모여놓고 슬라이드 배정하면 그 가족계에 새마을운동을 정말 부강한 나라를 배정하면 예? 거기에다 비교하는 거야. 우리나라 인구가 많아갖고 너무 못 살고 가뜩이나 가난한 데다가 못 사니까 인구 좀 줄이려면 산화 제한해야 된다.
차 같은 것도 대님에 거는 것도 하고 말하자면 이제 남자들 쓰는 거 그런 것도 주고 그렇게 했어 옛날에.
The Western family planners formed armies of so-called health workers in cooperation with the Korean government. Thousands of them combed the country, registering fertile couples and urging them to use contraception. Contraceptives publicly distributed that would have previously been inconceivable in South Korea as well as in other parts of the world.
나는 62년도 한 22살이었거든. 처녀 때인데 이제 군에서 이제 데려다 교육을 가르치는 거야. 콘돔 같은 거 사용하는 거 그런 거 알려주라고. 그래갖고 처녀가 다니면 그 홍보 요원이었거든. 성문에. 그래가지고 가족끼리 걸어서 다니면서 그 콘돔 쓰는 방법 알려주고 처녀가.
Western countries donated buses and jeeps that were converted into mobile medical units. Documents show that their task was not health promotion. The Population Council, an American foundation, expressed a clear-cut mission to the Korean Ministry of Health. These vehicles are given to help improve living standards in Korea through a vigorous attack on the problem of excessive population growth.
가족계획에서 줄이자. 그런 정책적으로만 하니까 너도 나도 아기가 많으면 다 짓는 거야. 그렇게 그게 좋은 거 같으니까 자기네들이 자발적으로 가서 아기 낙태시키는 거야. 산부인과 가서 뭐 법이 안 걸려. 그냥 가서 유산시키러 가면 해주고.
Instead of letting citizens plan their own families, family planners made having fewer children a citizen's duty. They were not interested in fighting poverty, but only in preventing the poor from having babies. Mobile clinics in India went to secluded villages as early as 1956, because Indians were also supposed to have fewer children. Western family planners flooded the country. One of the pioneers was the American doctor Sheldon Siegel. He founded a department for reproductive medicine in one of the largest state hospitals in New Delhi and trained Indian medical students. Although early versions of IUDs had fallen into disrepute in the West, Siegel smuggled them to India in 1964. He declared them as Christmas decorations at customs and had them inserted into the uteri of women without the knowledge of the government. In a letter, he wrote, "The present approach is to distribute the ones I have on hand to private gynecologists. We are also inserting some in monkey uteri. My feeling is that in the long run, it may be faster to quietly accumulate evidence from these sources before trying to press for wider distribution in government family planning clinics. I do not want to raise the question with Health Minister Dr. Nayar if the answer is likely to be negative, because we would then be in a precarious position if we pursue human studies at all." It didn't take long for the Indian government to give the green light. The United States Agency for International Development even sent non-sterile intrauterine devices to India. Serious complications often arose, sometimes with fatal consequences. Despite this, the family planners increased the pressure, and the Indian government cooperated. They set quotas for sterilizations and IUD insertion, paying doctors and health workers premiums. Poor, uneducated women were the main targets. The bait, money in exchange for their fertility.
So you had this system where people at every level were being given money. Money from the United States, from the United Nations, from Sweden, from Norway, money to agree to sterilization, or money to get other people to agree to sterilization, even if in some cases that eventually meant rounding them up and trucking them to camps where they were sometimes sterilized under the most appalling circumstances.
Sheldon Siegel visited one of these camps in 1962. He described it to his superior. "I spent Sunday at a women's sterilization camp and found it fascinating. After the surgeon sews up the abdomen, the ladies get off the operating table by themselves and walk out of the operating theater. I can honestly say that the operating conditions and adherence to sterility that Dr. Malkani and I observe in doing our hysterectomies in monkeys for actual insertion are infinitely better. Yet, who can argue with success?" The situation in India got out of control. In 1975, the government of Indira Gandhi forced 8 million women and men to undergo sterilization. This dark chapter in Indian history became known as Emergency Period.
The idea of population control, what was so seductive to national leaders, people like Indira Gandhi, was the idea that they could achieve modernity in one generation. And they could do it with crash programs. Even if it required taking some risks, even if some people were going to get hurt, this was something that was going to make India a modern nation, and it was going to improve everyone's welfare in the long run. What they didn't understand, though, was that in many rural societies, these children were their parents' only source of security in old age, right? And not only that, but in poorer societies, even children in many cases are able to support themselves and help their parents, even from a relatively young age. People at places like the Population Council and the Ford Foundation, they realized that parents in poor societies in many cases preferred to have sons. And what they began to think was that if only they had some way of helping those parents determine whether the fetus was a female or a male, then they might, along with abortion, they might have a quick way of reducing fertility rates.
The head of the Population Council determined a clear direction in 1967. Augmented research efforts leading to improved contraceptive technologies or practical methods of determining the sex of an unborn child so that parents could be assured of a son. In the early 1970s, the time had finally come. Scientists developed chorionic villus sampling, or CVS. With this method, a child's sex could be identified before birth. Abortion was forbidden in almost all developing countries. Sheldon Siegel and his colleagues used their connections to the highest ranks in the US government, and with great success. Henry Kissinger was US President Gerald Ford's Secretary of State at the time. In a 1974 document that was long kept classified, he demanded the massive depopulation of developing countries and declared abortion to be an indispensable tool for population control. No country has reduced its population growth without resorting to abortion. While women in the United States were still heading to the streets to demand the right to control their own bodies, American foundations and politicians were pressuring developing countries to legalize abortion. In the following decades, a massive surplus of men was created in Asia through the abortion of daughters. The consequences are omnipresent in India today. Once again, those who suffer most are girls and women of low socioeconomic standing, like 19-year-old Sajina.
मेरा माँ भी थी, एक बड़ा बहन भी थी, उन्होंने एक दिन आगे पीछे दोनों मर गई.
Today, Sajina lives with her brother Shamsul's family. He is her protector and saved her life 3 years ago when she suddenly disappeared from her village. Flashback. After Sajina vanished, Shamsul sold everything, traveled 2,000 kilometers to New Delhi, and reported her disappearance to the aid organization of Nobel laureate Kailash Satyarthi.
कोई नौकरी में गया था, कोई लड़के उसको नौकरी करने के लिए बोला था, उसने मना कर दिया और उस दिन से वो गायब.
Shamsul was not able to accomplish anything on his own. Even the police turned him away several times. When pressured by the aid organization, the police finally took action in the village where Sajina was being held. A woman claiming to be Sajina's mother-in-law pulled out a marriage certificate. The shortage of women is particularly extreme in the northern Indian state of Haryana. Parents desperately look for wives for their sons. The village elder ultimately explained what happened to Sajina.
लेकिन एक बात बताओ मुझको, ये लड़की जो है यहाँ से मतलब जो है निकाह में आई है और इसके 10 गवाह हैं, ये क्या बात है?
The truth finally came out when the residents turned the girl over to the police. The entire village had collected money to buy Sajina for a number of bachelors. She was married to one man and abused as a sex slave by 7 others. This is one of the consequences of the severe lack of women. Jazeera is not an exception. Human traffickers go through slums looking for girls. When they disappear, hardly anyone goes looking for them. The traffickers are often acquaintances or neighbors. Girls and women like Jazeera suffer the consequences of population policies introduced and expedited by Western family planners 50 years ago in India.
No pregnant woman thought that she could selectively kill girls and have only boys. So this was created by the so-called academic medical profession, promoted by Ford Foundation and a lot of other NGOs which funded the whole project. I think they took 30 students per year in BSc genetics. So in about 5 years, there was a corpus of a few hundred people who could tell whether it's a boy or a girl.
The gynecologist Puneet Bedi was trained at the same hospital where Sheldon Siegel carried on his research.
I was told it is a project and there's research going on, somebody's writing a paper on it, and how to find out if it's a boy or a girl before birth by doing amniocentesis. And if it's a girl, of course, then we abort.
Prenatal sex determination was the biggest breakthrough in population control. This way, girls were aborted en masse, and birth rates were reduced twofold. Fewer babies were being born, and fewer girls that could later bear children. Daughters are weeded out in China as well. 1 in 5 boys presently born will later not be able to find a wife. Mothers are worried. They advertise at countless marriage markets for their surplus sons. In Shanghai, there's such a market every Sunday in People's Park.
I是第二次来，在这里为小孩那个呀找缘啊寻缘啊。OK。情况啊，但是问的人多呀，问的人有多，然后就问了以后，他们比如我是男孩，他回去问，把我的电话号码抄回去，问他女儿同意的话，然后就用电话方式联系的。电话方式、微信方式，然后就由孩子们自己去联系，家长只是在这里牵一个线。
These are mothers who have only one son because they were permitted to have only one child. This was the Chinese strategy for population control.
London is one of the most important cities in the world, and decisions made here have an impact right around the globe. And so here at Al Jazeera, we will show you the true impact of those decisions on people and how it affects their everyday life. We are free to put them on air and to really engage with those stories because we know that our audience is interested not just in the mainstream news, but also the more hidden stories from parts of the world that often go underreported.
Seen as a burden, countless babies are aborted in India simply for being girls. But amidst fierce resistance, even from her own patients, a fearless midwife has adopted the cause of challenging deeply ingrained traditions and terminating this modern-day feticide. The Daughter Tree. Witness on Al Jazeera.
On Counting the Costs, the Great Lockdown, Africa to sink into its first recession in 25 years. Can its health service take the strain of the pandemic? An historic production cut, but what does it mean for Gulf economies? Plus, Europe's corona bonds. Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera.
Bold and untold stories from Asia and the Pacific on Al Jazeera.
Hello, I'm Nick Clark in Doha. The top stories here on Al Jazeera. And a care home in Italy is under investigation after it emerged nearly 200 residents had died there since the start of the coronavirus outbreak. The facility in Milan is suspected of concealing numerous COVID-19 fatalities since February. It's feared the number of deaths in care homes in Europe is far higher than originally thought. The World Health Organization is warning that Africa could become the next epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic. So far, there have been fewer than 1,000 deaths across the continent, which is a much lower rate than in the US and Europe. The United Nations says it's likely the virus will kill at least 300,000 people in Africa.
In the past week, there has been a 51% increase in the number of reported cases in my own continent, Africa, and a 60% increase in the number of reported deaths. With the current challenge of obtaining testing kits, it's likely that the real numbers are higher than reported.
Businesses in Iran's capital will begin reopening on Saturday. That is despite warnings from health authorities about a second wave of infections. The government is trying to shift its focus towards saving the economy from complete collapse. Brazil's president has defended his decision to fire his health minister after they clashed over his approach to tackling the pandemic. Jair Bolsonaro repeatedly downplayed the threat of coronavirus, but says he will take responsibility for his decisions.
History will judge us, and I ask God that we are right. This struggle to start opening up for business is a risk that I will take. If it gets worse, it's on me. What I believe, and what lots of people are coming to realize, is that the country has to open up.
China is facing renewed criticism over its handling of the pandemic after it revised its official death toll in the city where the outbreak began. Nearly 1,300 more fatalities were added to the Italian Wuhan city, a 50% increase. Beijing has dismissed claims of a cover-up. The UK has announced a new government-led task force and millions of dollars worth of funding for a coronavirus vaccine. The British Business Secretary says it is crucial for controlling the outbreak. All right, you're up to date with the headlines here on Al Jazeera. Now it's back to the politics of population control. Bye for now.
Affluent Americans started a new movement. Most of them were men, from well-known scientists to the super-rich like John D. Rockefeller III. Together, they wanted to curb the large numbers of children worldwide.
So you had this system where people at every level were being given money. Money from the United States, from the United Nations, from Sweden, from Norway, money to agree to sterilization, or money to get other people to agree to sterilization.
Prenatal sex determination was the biggest breakthrough in population control. This way, girls were aborted en masse. Daughters are weeded out in China as well. 1 in 5 boys presently born will later not be able to find a wife. U.S. President Richard Nixon and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger arrived in Beijing in 1972. It was a historic meeting with Mao Zedong about the balance of power and the mutual commitment to world peace.
There is no reason for us to be enemies. Neither of us seeks domination over the other. Neither of us seeks to stretch out our hands and rule the world.
But the fear of the Americans of Chinese supremacy, and thus the supremacy of communism, was great, and the fear that Chinese population growth seemed unstoppable. After Nixon's visit, the floodgates opened for Western family planners. The Chinese government had a sympathetic ear for them. Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, introduced the one-child policy. millions were trained as lay health workers, the so-called barefoot doctors. Their mission, distributing contraceptives all over the country and ensuring that couples only had one child. Family planning became a matter of state. If anyone expected a second child, they faced draconian punishments. The government used graffiti on building facades, warning people to obey. You can beat it out, you can kill it, you just cannot give birth to it. Although the media reported forced sterilization and abortions, the West donated money to the Chinese population program. At first, this only came from organizations like the Ford Foundation, but in 1979, even the United Nations Population Fund gave $50 million to the Chinese government. An employee of IPPF, one of the donor organizations, sounded the alarm. I think that in the not-too-distant future, this will blow up into a major press story, as it contains all the ingredients for sensationalism. Communism, forced family planning, murder of viable fetuses, parallels with India, etc. When it does blow up, it is going to be very difficult to defend. But the warnings were not only ignored. The UN Population Fund also presented China with an award for outstanding contributions regarding birth control.
Who did they choose to give it to? It wasn't to reproductive rights advocates. It wasn't to people whose lives were at risk because they were trying to campaign to give people, and especially women, the right to own and control their own bodies. It was just the opposite. They decided to honor the leader of China's coercive population control program, a Chinese general, who had presided over the most egregious period in the entire history of that program. And they chose to honor Indira Gandhi, who was responsible for what until then was the worst population program of all, the emergency period program in India.
Why did the UN Population Fund support countries financially that forced people to be sterilized and have abortions?
You have to bring money to improve the kind of contraception they used, which was healthier and safer for them. While you are improving their health, you also have to be in a country to be able to talk to authorities to say, you have invited us in, here is a better way of helping your women.
Tell me the whole rationale for giving Indira Gandhi the first population award after the forced sterilization of so many people, as well as to the Chinese general.
Now, I need to be very clear about the role of UNFPA. Those awards were given by the United Nations member states. That is it. We carry out their instructions.
At that time, the United States was the most important member state, contributing 40% of the budget. Was the UN Population Fund simply the puppet of its benefactors? "40 years after these population policies supported by the West, over 30 million Chinese men remain involuntary bachelors because of the shortage of women. This is why millions of unemployed men from rural areas move to the cities. As migrant workers, they aim to earn money to improve their chances of finding a bride. Li Pin works in a selfie stick factory near Hong Kong. At 27, he also does not have a girlfriend yet.
因为到这个年龄嘛，然后家里面人、父母都会催婚那样子，然后说很重要，为了家里面人、父母。在老家没有女朋友的话，这样的话，别人都会感觉你是不是干嘛没本事还是干嘛的这样子。在中国，像比较年龄比较大的啊，这有个称呼啊，叫做光棍。
The number of guangun continues to increase, especially in the countryside. Chinese women prefer well-off men from the city. China's problematic lack of women will not change in the coming decades. Current birth records show a continued gender imbalance amongst newborns. Parallel to the increased lack of women, the trafficking of girls, prostitution, and child abductions have risen dramatically in China. The activist Du Yin visits the parents of Pang Shuting, the little girl who disappeared. But he has no good news. There is still no trace of their 3-year-old daughter.
本能感觉，不知道，反正就是感觉他肯定还好好的，因为也没有，那些池塘也没有看到什么，反正也没有血啊，这些肯定是他是安全的，然后我就等消息吧，还是很担心的。
The girls are often abducted by someone from the village. Before the child reaches the person who contracted to have her taken, she will have passed through many hands. With each transaction, the price goes up. Ultimately, the product girl costs roughly $8,000. And for the buyers, the deal always pays off.
对啊，儿子不喜欢的话，比如养大了儿子不，两人性格合不来什么的，不喜欢，他还会嫁出去，当女儿，反正当女儿养的嘛，嫁出去，嫁出去不是礼金啊，什么东西，又是一笔可观的费用，收入、彩礼啊、礼金啊这样，反正也是一样的。男孩结婚接一个老婆回来，不是也要付出了那么多的礼金嘛？但是他作为一个女儿，他也要把女儿养大以后，养大以后。 嫁出去，那礼金他不也照样收回来？
我是庞秀田的亲生妈妈，不要虐待她就好。如果真正有机会的话，有缘分的话，让我们见一面，我会非常感谢你的。其他责任我都不会追究你。
谢谢，多多善待她。
如果身边有发现的话，请你一定要告诉我们，或者是好好的，不要让他受伤害这样子。
Statistics in India show the higher the surplus of men, the higher the crime rate and the number of violent crimes against women. The American political scientist Valerie Hudson researches and teaches the impact of this surplus of men at the Bush School of Government in Texas.
What everybody has been up to this week, and we'll start with Megan at the back.
You're creating a pool of already socially disadvantaged young men, right, who are already predisposed to challenge the established order. Now you've deepened their grievance. There is no hope for them to finally become adult men within their society without taking more drastic action.
Statistically, the majority of crimes worldwide is committed by young, unattached men. When men enter into relationships or have children, the likelihood of them committing a crime decreases. Valerie Hudson views Asia's massive surplus of men as a serious threat to global stability.
When you get instability and violence and insecurity in the two most populous nations on earth, I don't see how that can't spill over into global international relations. Whether we're talking about the rise of China, whether we're talking about the future of India as a democracy, I think all of these questions are affected by what's going on with the women of India and China.
Meanwhile, the Indian government reacted and outlawed sex determination in the early 1990s. And yet, there have never been as many abortions of girls as today, because with ultrasound technology, sex determination has become cheap and safe. Despite the ban, it is only a question of money to find a doctor who is willing to break the law and reveal the gender of the unborn child. The middle class in India is growing, and as expected, educated Indians want fewer children. Little has changed about the preference for sons, especially in the upper class. Amisha was 25 years old when she married a computer scientist. Her father-in-law was a high-ranking government employee. In India, the bride must pay the groom's family a dowry. Amisha gave her in-laws an apartment. Having a son is like winning the lottery for some people in India.
मतलब उन लोगों को लड़के की चाह थी और मतलब वो मानते थे कि लड़का तो होना ही चाहिए, लड़के के बिना कुछ नहीं, लड़का तो कुल दीपक तो चाहिए। मुझे पूरी तरह से अंधेरे में रखा गया, तो मुझे चलो डॉक्टर के साथ उन्होंने क्या बात की मुझे कुछ नहीं पता होता है। डॉक्टर जैसे चेकअप करता है वैसे उन्होंने कोड वर्ड रखा था, ऐसे भी बोल रहे थे कि जय माता जी। अगर लड़की होती है तो डॉक्टर बोल देता है कि जय माता जी, तो वो समझ जाते हैं कि लड़की है। तो भाई चलो मतलब वो डॉक्टर बोलते हैं कि दोबारा से लेके आना इन लोगों को, या फिर ये भी इंजेक्शन होता है या कुछ होता है उस तरह से, जो उसके बाद में कुछ नहीं होता। मैं जब होश में आती हूँ तो मैं कुछ नहीं होता है, बस वही होता है मेरे साथ। 8 साल में 6 बार। तो बच्ची नहीं मरी, मैं ही मरी हूँ, ऐसा ही आता है। कहीं ना कहीं मैं मर गई हूँ इसमें। ये मेरी बेबी के टाइम भी वो लोग ऐसा, तो फिर मेरी तबीयत फिर ऐसे हुआ तो तबीयत मेरी बहुत वीक होने लगी, तो मैं मम्मी के घर पे आ गई ये बेबी के टाइम पे। तो उस टाइम भी उन्होंने कैसे भी करके मुझे यहाँ से ले जाना चाहा, पर मैं गई नहीं। फिर तो रात को घर से मुझे मार के निकाल दिया, आधी रात का टाइम था, घर से मार के निकाल दिया कि तू निकल, अब अगर तू बेटा नहीं दे सकती तो तू निकल घर से।
For a woman to be cast out by her in-laws is nothing short of the societal death penalty in India. As in China and India, the lack of women of marriageable age in South Korea has now become a problem.
여기 사약시가 적어서 농사 짓는 사람이 이제 아가씨가 없잖아. 그러니까 거기는 이제 아가씨 가서 얻어놓은 이제 돈 한 1,000만 원씩은 들여한대야. 베트남사 얻어오려면. 그렇게 해서 데려오는데 한 20살 칭한 돼요. 그런데 오면 아주 애기는 이쁘게 잘 나. 둘씩 낳았어. 우리 집에도 많이 왔어.
그럼 만약에 그러면 여기 할머니 이제 아드님들이 만약에 결혼을 못 하셨을 때 그러면 베트남 소녀랑 결혼하면 어떻게 생각하세요?
아주 무덤은 어디 하지?
A lucrative business has emerged around women as a commodity. That which is missing in one's own market after decades of selective abortion is simply imported from poorer neighboring countries. But South Korea faces another problem. Nowadays, South Korean women do not want to have children at all. The population is drastically declining. Once again, politics has intervened with drastic measures. Whereas young women 60 years ago were encouraged to have abortions, now it is strongly frowned upon and criminally prosecuted to terminate a pregnancy. Lee Hae-young and Wang Shi-sung, two students from Seoul, recalled what they learned at school on the subject of abortion.
초등학교 다닐 때부터 약간 뭐 임신이나 낙태에 대해서 그런 교육들을 좀 많이 했었어요. 근데 시청각 자료를 이렇게 보여주면서 낙태는 이렇게 태아가 뱃속에 있을 때 몸을 잘라서 그렇게 낙태를 하는 거다. 일단 안에서 잘라서 밖으로 배출을 하는 거다. 그게 낙태다. 그리고 낙태는 살인이다. 이렇게 계속 학교에서부터 그렇게 교육을 시키니까 그게 되게 깊숙이 자리 잡고 안 좋게 인식이 될 수밖에 없는 것 같아요.
The young women examined the subject of abortion for their master's thesis. Byun Hwa-soon, who directed the Women's Development Institute in Seoul for 25 years, is an advisor to the students. The students track down dubious agencies that arbitrate illegal abortions for large sums of money. Once again, women are the victims of population policy. Illegal abortions bear great health risks, but the South Korean government holds on to the ban of abortion. Today, their mission is offspring at all costs.
여성의 몸을 도구화, 그러니까 우리가 여성 정책이라고 정부가 여성의 몸을 어떻게 도구화했는가는 여성의 정책을 목적으로 하는 건지 아니면 국가 정책을 위해서 수단화했는 것인지 그렇게 나눠볼 수 있다면 산하 제한에 대해서는 여성의 몸을 수단화했다고 볼 수 있습니다.
The South Korean government has gone so far as to publish a map of Seoul on the internet showing where women of childbearing age live. The darker the pink color, the greater the selection for men seeking a wife. The Chinese government has also noticed that a society without women will die out in the long run. A two-child policy has been introduced in hopes of regaining a gender balance and solving the problem of an aging population. The government is again resorting to advertisements on building facades. This time, it is for daughters and therefore for potential future mothers. No girls, no daughters-in-law. The government in India is also backpedaling. It also wants to motivate people to give birth to daughters. There's one information campaign after another. Once again, the Indian government is offering incentives. Whoever gives birth to a daughter receives $35 and a thank you letter from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. The gynecologist Puneet Bedi is familiar with the pressure on pregnant women. He too performs abortions, but never when it is a matter of the sex of the fetus. Dr. Bedi does not think much of the new government programs.
Give me one reason how I suppose as a woman, she's pregnant, who's never gone to school. The day she was born, she was told that she's shit because she's a woman, and then she gets pregnant in a new home where 7 other people are telling her every day that, you will lose everything that you have in life if you produce a girl. How do you change her mindset? By showing some street play, or writing a poem, or inventing a television spot. No, it doesn't work. Now, the ultimate solution is, of course, that people start respecting girls more than boys.
They wanted to protect the world from a population explosion, but they waged war on the poor, not on poverty. Had they supported education and economic security of women, birth rates would have gone down on their own. Instead, they forced contraception, sterilization, and abortion. History is repeating itself. The UN Population Fund still uses 60% of their aid fund for family planning. And once again, private foundations demand population reduction. At the time, they based their arguments on scarce resources. Today, it is climate change.
It makes me nervous that just as in the 1950s and 60s, it was the Rockefeller and Ford Foundation that issued marching orders to people all over the world. It makes me nervous when I hear it's the Gates Foundation now, because of its money, that's playing a preponderant role in global public health. Similarly, when back in the 1950s and 60s, you had leaders from all over the world agreeing that population growth was a crisis, right? And agreeing that the United Nations had to implement crash programs. It makes me nervous now when people talk about the crisis of climate change and how it is we might even have to engage in crash programs.
Today, Africa is the main focus for population control. The World Bank and the UN Population Fund are currently pumping millions into family planning on the second largest continent, and a large American corporation is supplying the ultrasound devices. As in China, South Korea, and India, people in most African countries prefer sons.